After 5 years deployed overseas, I was finally driving home to suburban Chicago. Then my stomach dropped. I slammed the brakes. Coffee splashed everywhere. The quarter-acre lot I'd bought for my dream workshop was gone. In its place, a brand-new gated parking lot with fresh asphalt, electronic gates, and signs screaming, Willowbrook HOA Premium Parking, $75 month. 60 luxury cars packed in, earning someone thousands monthly on my land. I walked into the office trailer where HOA President Stephanie Blackwood barely looked up from counting cash. When I showed her my deed, she laughed.
Sweetie, this is community property. Take it up with our lawyers.
This trust fund princess was dismissing a returning veteran while profiting off stolen property. If you've ever dealt with an HOA like this, drop your city in the comments. Because what I did next, my engineering background and one remote-controlled valve, completely flipped the script. You won't believe how spectacular her downfall was. My name's Danny Kowalski, and this is exactly what happened to me. Back in 2018, I was running a successful plumbing business here in suburban Chicago, specializing in commercial hydraulics. Life was good, divorced but on decent terms with my ex-wife Sarah, 2 teenage boys who actually still wanted to hang out with their old man, and I'd just purchased this beautiful quarter-acre lot on Maple Street for $38 grand. The plan was simple. Build the workshop of my dreams. I'm talking about a proper man cave with hydraulic lifts, a full welding setup, space for the boys to learn real skills instead of staring at screens all day. Jake was 17, Tommy was 15, and they were actually excited about the project. We spent weekends walking the property, measuring out where everything would go. Then opportunity knocked. A military contractor offered me a 5-year position overseeing water treatment facilities in Eastern Europe. The money was incredible. Triple my normal rate, all expenses paid, enough to build that workshop properly when I got back. Sarah and I talked it through. The boys could stay with her, I'd video call twice a week, send money for their college funds. It seemed perfect. I remember that last morning in October 2019, standing on my empty lot with a cup of coffee that tasted like cardboard, visualizing the workshop one more time before I left. The ground was already getting hard with the first frost, that sharp, clean smell that means winter's coming. I had 5 years to plan every detail. Overseas, I threw myself into the work, installing massive pumping stations, coordinating with local engineers who spoke 3 languages, but somehow we always understood each other when pipes were involved. Every few months, I'd pull up Google Earth and look at my lot, still empty, still waiting. The boys would text me pictures sometimes. Dad's future workshop looking lonely with some joke about weeds getting taller. The separation was harder than expected. Sarah started dating someone new in year 3, a banker named Greg who apparently knew nothing about tools but could discuss mortgage rates for hours. The boys grew distant. Video calls became monthly check-ins, then holiday greetings. I told myself it was temporary. 5 years and I'd be home to make up for lost time. Meanwhile, I had no idea what was happening back in Willowbrook Estates. See, our HOA was run by this trust fund princess named Stephanie Blackwood. Real piece of work. 38 years old, never held a real job, inherited her board position when her daddy moved to Florida. Stephanie drove a pristine white Lexus that she detailed twice a week and treated working-class folks like we were there for her entertainment. While I was installing pumps in Romania, Stephanie was looking at my empty lot and seeing dollar signs. In her mind, property sitting unused was property being wasted. She convinced the board that my lot was abandoned and that the community would benefit from improvements. Of course, she conveniently forgot to mention that someone actually owned that land. By 2021, Stephanie had convinced enough residents that a parking lot was desperately needed. People were tired of street parking, tired of walking 3 blocks from overflow areas. She pushed through a vote, hired her friend's construction company, and built 60 premium parking spaces complete with electronic gates and monthly billing. The smell of fresh asphalt, the sound of hydraulic gate motors, the steady ping of cars backing up, my empty lot had become a proper business operation. Stephanie was collecting $75 a month per space, pulling in over $4,000 monthly from my land. But here's the thing about women like Stephanie. They're so used to getting their way, they never bother checking if what they're doing is actually legal. 5 years later, I'm finally coming home, expecting to see weeds and maybe some kids' bike tracks. Instead, I'm staring at Stephanie's little empire, built entirely on property she never owned. The first thing I did was sit in my rental car for about 10 minutes, just staring. You know that feeling when reality doesn't match what your brain expects? Like when you walk into your childhood bedroom and your parents turned it into an office. Except this was worse because this was my land, my money, my dreams, sitting under about 4 inches of asphalt. I finally got out and walked around the perimeter. The parking lot was busy. Luxury cars everywhere. BMW sedans, a couple of Mercedes SUVs, even a Tesla that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. These weren't people who needed affordable parking. These were people who paid for convenience. There was a small office trailer at the entrance with a sign. Willowbrook Premium Parking. Stephanie Blackwood, Community Development Manager. Through the window, I could see Stephanie herself, leaning back in a chair with her feet up, scrolling through her phone. She looked exactly the same. That soft, privileged face that had never seen a day of real work. Designer nails clicking against her phone case. I knocked on the trailer door. Stephanie looked up, annoyed at being interrupted from whatever important business she was conducting on Instagram. "Help you?" she said, not getting up, that fake sweet voice that meant trouble. "Yeah, I'm Danny Kowalski. I own the land this parking lot is built on." Stephanie actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A genuine, dismissive chuckle like I'd told her I was the King of England. "Sweetie, this is HOA property. Has been for years. We improved abandoned land that was becoming an eyesore." She gestured around like she was showing off the Sistine Chapel. "Community voted on it. Everything's legal and proper." I pulled out my phone and showed her a picture of my deed. "This says otherwise." That's when Stephanie's demeanor changed. She stood up, crossed her arms, and looked at me like I was something stuck to her designer shoe. "Listen, honey, I don't know what game you're playing, but this parking facility serves 200 families in this community. If you've got some claim to make, you can take it up with our lawyers." "I'm not making a claim," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm stating a fact. This is my property, and you built on it without permission." Stephanie walked past me and opened the trailer door, her perfume hitting me like a chemical weapon. "I think we're done here. This is private property now, so I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a pipe wrench. Over the next few days, I tried the reasonable approach. I called the HOA office, left messages explaining the situation. I even went to a board meeting thinking maybe this was all a misunderstanding that could be worked out between adults. Stephanie had used those few days well. When I walked into the community center conference room, I was facing 5 board members who looked at me like I was there to steal their Christmas presents. Stephanie had positioned herself at the head of the table, a stack of papers in front of her, wearing a power suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Mr. Kowalski," she said with that fake friendly tone that means someone's about to screw you over, "we've reviewed your concerns about the parking facility. Our legal counsel has confirmed that the property in question was improved under adverse possession statutes after being abandoned for over 3 years. She slid a document across the table with those manicured nails. "These are the papers establishing HOA ownership. Everything's been filed properly with the county." I looked at the documents. They were impressive. Official letterhead, legal language, stamps, and signatures. They were also complete fabrications. The adverse possession claim cited statutes that didn't exist, and the signatures looked like they'd been practiced in someone's garage. But here's what I learned during my time overseas. When you're dealing with corrupt officials, you don't win by getting angry. You win by being smarter and more patient than they are. So I smiled, nodded, and said, "I'll have my attorney review these." Stephanie's smug grin told me everything I needed to know. She thought she'd won. She thought some blue-collar plumber who'd been out of the country for 5 years couldn't possibly challenge her little empire. That night, I called my old surveyor buddy Jim Rodriguez. "Jim, I need you to do me a favor and pull the original property lines for my lot on Maple Street. Yeah, the one with the parking lot on it. And Jim, make sure you're precise, down to the inch." The next morning, Jim called back with news that made my day. "Danny, you're not going to believe this. That parking lot extends 15 feet onto Stephanie's own property. Her precious rose garden, it's sitting on the public easement." Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. Armed with Jim's survey results, I decided it was time to have another conversation with Stephanie. But this time, I brought documentation. I found her at the parking lot office the next Tuesday morning, wearing a designer blouse that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. She was on the phone, laughing about something involving a spa weekend and mimosas. The kind of conversation that reminded you some people have never worried about making rent. When she saw me approaching, she quickly ended the call and put on her serious business face. Mr. Kowalski, I thought we settled this matter. We did, I said, spreading Jim's survey map on her desk. Turns out your parking lot extends 15 feet past my property line. You built on your own land, too. Stephanie glanced at the map like it was written in ancient Egyptian, her perfectly contoured eyebrows furrowing. I don't know what this is supposed to prove. It proves you don't actually know where property lines are. I pointed to the section where her parking spaces overlapped her backyard. See this area here? That's where you tore up your rose garden to build spaces 47 through 52. Except according to county records, that's actually public easement. You can't build permanent structures on easement land. For the first time since I'd met her, Stephanie looked genuinely uncomfortable, her confidence cracking like cheap nail polish. That's impossible. Our contractor checked everything. Your contractor checked whatever you told him to check. I folded up the survey. But here's the thing, Stephanie. I'm not here to cause problems for the community. I just want to work something out that's fair for everyone. That was my mistake. Trying to be reasonable with someone who viewed reasonableness as weakness. 3 days later, I was working under the kitchen sink at my temporary apartment when there was a knock at the door. 2 police officers stood on my porch, looking official and slightly bored. "Daniel Kowalski?" the older officer asked. "That's me." "We have a restraining order here. You're not allowed within 50 feet of 847 Maple Street or the Willowbrook Premium Parking Facility." I stared at the papers. Stephanie had filed an emergency protective order claiming I was harassing residents and threatening community safety. According to her sworn statement, I had aggressively confronted her multiple times and made veiled threats about property destruction. "Officer," I said carefully, "that parking lot is built on my land. I have the deed and survey to prove it." The younger officer shrugged. "That's a civil matter, sir. This is a criminal matter. Stay away from the property until you work it out in court." After they left, I sat on my couch staring at the restraining order. Stephanie had played this perfectly. Now I couldn't even set foot on my own property without risking arrest. I was effectively locked out of my own land by a piece of paper full of lies. But Stephanie had made one crucial mistake. While I was overseas, I'd learned to deal with bureaucrats who thought paperwork was more important than facts. The secret is understanding that every system has rules, and if you know the rules better than the people trying to bend them, you can turn their own game against them. I spent the next 2 days at the county recorder's office, pulling every document related to my property going back to 1965. Property deeds, utility easements, construction permits, tax records, everything. What I found was fascinating. The original utility easement for my property was granted in 1967 to Commonwealth Electric for a main power line running from Maple Street to the transformer station. That easement gave them the right to access a 10-foot corridor along the southern edge of my lot for maintenance and repairs. But here's the interesting part. Stephanie's parking lot had been built directly over that easement, not just touching it, completely blocking it. And according to the utility company's own records, they'd been paying Stephanie's HOA $1,500 a month for alternate access routes because they couldn't reach their equipment through the original easement. I called Commonwealth Electric and spoke with their facilities manager, a woman named Carol, who sounded like she'd been dealing with utility access issues since before electricity was invented. "Mr. Kowalski, we've been trying to get proper access restored for 3 years, she said. The HOA keeps promising to provide a solution, but they keep cashing our checks and giving us the runaround. What would happen if you needed emergency access to that transformer?" I asked. "Well, we'd have to shut down power to about 400 homes until we could bring in emergency equipment. But honestly, if someone's blocking a utility easement without authorization, that's a violation of state code. We could file a complaint with the Public Utilities Commission." And I smiled for the first time in days. "Carol, I think I can help you with that access problem." Stephanie thought she was playing chess, but she didn't realize I'd been studying the board for a lot longer than she had. While I was building my case with utility records, Stephanie was busy consolidating her position. She called an emergency HOA meeting for the following Thursday, 7 p.m. sharp at the community center. The agenda had one item: addressing threats to community safety and property values. I couldn't attend, of course, thanks to her restraining order, but my neighbor, Mrs. Vanessa, an 80-year-old retired teacher who'd lived in Willowbrook since the houses were built, filled me in afterward. She knocked on my door around 9:30 with a plate of homemade cookies and a look that could have melted steel. "Danny, that girl's got some nerve," she said, settling into my kitchen chair with the authority of someone who'd outlived 3 HOA presidents. "She stood up there and told everyone you were some kind of dangerous criminal trying to steal community property." According to Mrs. Vanessa, Stephanie had really put on a show. She brought charts, photographs, even testimonials from residents about how much they loved the convenient parking. Then came the big finale, a motion to assess every household $3,000 for a legal defense fund to fight my hostile takeover attempt. $3,000, Mrs. Vanessa repeated, shaking her head. For people like the Hendersons who live on Social Security, that might as well be $30,000. Poor Helen Henderson started crying right there in the meeting. That hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been so focused on Stephanie's corruption that I hadn't considered how her games would hurt innocent people. Elderly folks on fixed incomes, young families already stretched thin by inflation, they'd all be paying for Stephanie's legal bills to defend something she'd built illegally in the first place. But Mrs. Vanessa wasn't finished. "Here's the thing that really gets me, Danny. That girl had the gall to say the parking money goes to community improvements. You know what improvements we've seen? Her fancy new Lexus and a lot of bills for administrative expenses. Meanwhile, the playground equipment's falling apart and the community pool's been temporarily closed for 2 years." After she left, I sat up most of the night thinking. Stephanie wasn't just stealing my land, she was stealing from every resident who believed their parking fees were helping the community. This wasn't about property rights anymore. This was about a con woman taking advantage of good people. The next morning I drove to the edge of Willowbrook, carefully staying 51 feet from the parking lot, and started knocking on doors. Not to complain about Stephanie, but to offer something she'd never provided, actual service to the community. "Hi, I'm Danny Kowalski," I'd say. "I'm a master plumber, and I heard some folks in the neighborhood might need help with winter pipe maintenance. No charge, just a neighbor helping neighbors." Word spread fast. Mrs. Henderson needed her water heater looked at. The Garcias had a persistent drip in their basement. Young couple on Oak Street was worried about frozen pipes in their new baby's room. I spent 3 days crawling under houses, adjusting water pressure, and explaining how to prevent costly repairs. Here's what I learned. People were frustrated with Stephanie's management, but they felt powerless to change anything. She controlled the board meetings, the financials, the communication channels. Most residents had no idea where their parking money actually went or how HOA decisions were really made. But here's what Stephanie didn't understand about working-class communities. We take care of each other. Every house I fixed became an ally. Every neighbor who watched me work for free began to question why Stephanie charged for everything but delivered nothing. The breakthrough came on Sunday afternoon. I was helping Mr. Peterson replace a corroded shutoff valve when he mentioned something that made me stop what I was doing. "You know, Danny, it's funny," he said, holding my flashlight steady while I tightened connections. "Stephanie keeps talking about how that parking lot serves the community, but half the spaces sit empty most days. And my electric bill's been sky high ever since they built it. Something about increased grid usage in our area." I looked up from the pipe fitting. "Pete, what did you say about the electric bill?" "Commonwealth Electric added a surcharge 2 years ago. Said there was increased demand from commercial operations in our neighborhood." Pete shrugged. "I figured it was from all those new shops over on Main Street." That night, I called Carol at Commonwealth Electric again. "Carol, I need to ask you about electrical usage at the Willowbrook parking lot." "Oh, that's a whole separate issue," she said. "They're pulling commercial level power for those gate motors and security lights, but they're still classified as residential. Technically, that's a code violation, but we've been too busy fighting for easement access to pursue it." Stephanie's house of cards was starting to show some serious cracks. Everything changed the following Tuesday when I got a call from Carol at Commonwealth Electric. Her voice had that excited edge that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. And it wasn't going to be me. "Danny, you need to get down to the county planning office right now. Ask for Mike Brennan in code enforcement. Tell him Carol from Commonwealth sent you about the Willowbrook utility violation." Mike Brennan turned out to be a guy who looked like he'd been enforcing building codes since before Stephanie was born. Gray mustache, permanent squint from reading blueprints, and the kind of patience that comes from dealing with 30 years of developers who think rules don't apply to them. "So, you're the property owner," he said, spreading out a folder thick enough to choke a horse. "We've been building quite a file on your parking lot situation." What I learned in that cramped government office changed everything. Stephanie hadn't just built on my land without permission. She'd created a web of violations that stretched back 3 years. First, the parking lot was pulling commercial-level electricity, but was still classified as residential property. That's fraud, plain and simple. Commonwealth Electric had been overcharging every resident in the area to subsidize Stephanie's operation. Second, the construction was done without proper permits. Stephanie had filed paperwork for minor landscaping improvements, not a 60-space commercial parking facility with electronic gates and lighting systems. Third, and this was the big one, Stephanie had been filing fraudulent tax documents. For 3 years, she'd been claiming the parking lot as community amenity space to dodge commercial property taxes. Meanwhile, she'd been pocketing parking fees and reporting zero income to the IRS. But here's the interesting part, Mike said, pulling out a manila envelope. We got an anonymous tip last week with some very detailed financial records. He spread out photocopied bank statements, deposit slips, and what looked like Stephanie's personal accounting ledger. Someone had documented every deposit, every expense, every dollar that had flowed through Stephanie's parking operation. The numbers were staggering. Over 3 years, Stephanie had collected $225,000 in parking fees, but only $40,000 had gone to actual parking lot maintenance. The rest had disappeared into administrative expenses, which apparently included Stephanie's Lexus payments, her spa treatments, and several shopping trips to designer outlets in Chicago. "Who sent you this?" I asked. Mike smiled. "Can't tell you that, but I can tell you it came from someone with access to internal HOA records." I had a pretty good idea who our anonymous friend was. Mrs. Vanessa had mentioned that 3 board members resigned after learning Stephanie lied about property ownership. Apparently, one of them had decided to do something about it. But the real bombshell was in the last document, a contract between Stephanie's family trust and something called Blackwood Development LLC for parking lot construction and management. Same last name wasn't a coincidence. Stephanie hadn't just built an illegal parking lot, she'd created a shell company to funnel HOA money to herself. "What happens now?" I asked. Now we have enough evidence for the IRS, the State Tax Commission, and criminal fraud charges." Mike closed the folder. "But that's not your biggest advantage, Danny." He pulled out one more document, a stop work order dated 18 months ago that had never been served. "See, we tried to inspect the parking lot construction back in 2022, but Stephanie kept giving us the runaround, said she was out of town, couldn't meet inspectors, needed to reschedule. Eventually, we gave up and moved on to other cases." "But the stop work order is still valid?" "Absolutely, which means that parking lot has been operating illegally for 3 years. Mike stood up and shook my hand. "And here's the best part. Under state law, any revenue generated from an illegal commercial operation on residential property belongs to the actual property owner." I walked out of that office feeling like I'd just been handed the keys to Stephanie's kingdom. She'd built her little empire on lies, fraud, and other people's money. But she'd made one fatal mistake. She'd gotten greedy enough to leave a paper trail. Stephanie thought she was untouchable because she controlled the HOA board and had expensive lawyers. What she didn't realize was that bureaucrats like Mike Brennan don't care about your connections or your family money. They care about rules. And Stephanie had broken every rule in the book. The best part? She had no idea the walls were about to come tumbling down. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with legal pads, the county records, and about 6 cups of coffee that tasted like motivation. For the first time since I'd returned from overseas, I felt like myself again. Like the guy who could solve any hydraulic problem if you gave him enough time and the right tools. Stephanie had built her operation on deception, but deception only works when people don't know the truth. My job was to make sure the truth came out in the most spectacular way possible. First, I needed to understand exactly how Stephanie's drainage system worked. I spent 2 days walking the perimeter of the parking lot, staying 51 feet away, of course, and studying the water flow patterns. The lot was built with a slight grade that directed all runoff into a single drainage system that connected to the main sewer line. That main sewer line ran directly under my property before connecting to the city system. Here's something most people don't know about utility easements. If you own the property, you control access to utilities running through it. Stephanie's entire parking lot depended on drainage infrastructure that I legally controlled. I called my old crew chief from overseas, a Bulgarian engineer named Pavel who could make water flow uphill if you asked him nicely. Pavel, I need to ask you about remote valve systems, the kind we used for the emergency shutoffs in Bucharest. Ah, Danny, you want to play games with water pressure? Pavel laughed. Send me photos of pipe layout. I designed something very elegant. While Pavel worked on the technical solution, I focused on the legal strategy. I drove to downtown Chicago and met with Sarah Martinez, an attorney who specialized in property rights and municipal code enforcement. Sarah had the kind of reputation that made opposing lawyers consider early retirement. Danny, this is beautiful, she said, reviewing my evidence folder. It's like Christmas morning for someone who loves nailing fraudsters. The legal approach was simple. File simultaneous complaints with every relevant agency. County code enforcement for the unpermitted construction. State tax commission for the fraudulent tax filings. IRS for unreported income. Public Utilities Commission for the electrical violations. Each agency would conduct its own investigation, but together they'd create a bureaucratic avalanche that no amount of family money could stop. But here's the key, Sarah explained. Timing is everything. If Stephanie gets wind of one investigation, she'll try to cover her tracks for the others. We need to coordinate so all the complaints hit simultaneously. I reached out to Mrs. Vanessa and asked if she could quietly connect me with other concerned residents. Within a week, I had a coalition of 12 neighbors who were tired of Stephanie's games. Mrs. Henderson brought financial records showing how the parking fees had strained fixed-income residents. The Garcias documented how parking availability had actually decreased since Stephanie started charging fees. She'd eliminated 15 free spaces to create premium paid parking. Most importantly, I connected with David Kim, one of the 3 board members who'd resigned. David was a retired accountant who'd tried to audit HOA finances before Stephanie shut him down. He still had copies of the records that showed where the parking money really went. Danny, I've been waiting 3 years for someone to hold that woman accountable, David said over coffee. I'll testify about anything you need. For the physical component, Pavel had designed something elegant indeed. A remote-controlled valve system that could redirect drainage flow with the push of a button. The beauty was in its simplicity. I wasn't damaging anything or breaking any laws. I was just exercising my legal right to control water flow on my own property. The installation took place over 3 nights. Pavel flew in from Bulgaria, partly for the technical challenge, but mostly because he wanted to see Stephanie's face when the trap sprung. We worked in shifts, tunneling carefully to access the main drainage line without disturbing the parking lot surface. In Bucharest, we call this teaching the bureaucrats about gravity, Pavel said, adjusting the valve controls. Very effective lesson. The timing had to be perfect. I'd learned that Stephanie was planning a big 4th of July community barbecue in the parking lot, a PR move to show what a wonderful community leader she was. The event would draw maximum attendance, including local politicians, news media covering the community celebration, and all the residents who'd been paying for Stephanie's fraud. Sarah coordinated with agency investigators to ensure they'd be conducting routine inspections during the event. Mike Brennan promised that code enforcement would be doing their annual community safety review that afternoon. By June 30th, everything was in position. Stephanie was about to learn that when you build your empire on other people's land, you're always just one valve turn away from sinking. Stephanie must have sensed something was wrong because her behavior started getting desperate about 2 weeks before the 4th of July barbecue. It started with her hiring a private investigator, some ex-cop named Rick who drove around the neighborhood in an unmarked sedan that fooled absolutely no one. Mrs. Vanessa spotted Rick first, naturally. She called me Tuesday morning while I was reviewing Pavel's valve schematics for the 100th time. Danny, there's a woman in a brown Buick taking pictures of your apartment building, she said. Been sitting out there for 3 hours with a long camera lens. Looks like she's trying to catch you doing something wrong. I walked to my window and sure enough, there was Rick with a telephoto lens pointed right at my front door. The poor guy was probably expecting to catch me violating the restraining order or doing something that Stephanie could use in court. What he actually got were dozens of photos of me drinking coffee and reading property law books. But Rick's investigation backfired in ways Stephanie never expected. While digging into my background, Rick discovered something interesting. My overseas work had been for the U.S. military, not some sketchy private contractor like Stephanie had assumed. My security clearance was higher than most federal judges, and my military record was spotless. When Rick reported back to Stephanie, I imagine the conversation didn't go the way either of them planned. Here Stephanie was, trying to paint me as some dangerous vagrant, while her investigator was telling her I'd been building critical infrastructure for American military operations. That's when Stephanie made her first really stupid move. She showed up at Mrs. Henderson's house with an envelope full of cash. Mrs. Henderson called me immediately afterward, her voice shaking with anger. "Danny, that woman just offered me $500 to sign a statement saying you threatened me when you fixed my water heater. What did you tell her?" "I told her to get off my property before I called the police." Her voice got stronger. "Then I called David Kim and told him what happened. David says we should document everything Stephanie does from now on." The bribery attempt was amateur hour, but it showed Stephanie was panicking. David Kim started quietly reaching out to other residents Stephanie had approached. Turned out, Stephanie had been making rounds all week, offering money for statements that would support her version of events. The Garcias got offered $300 to say I'd been casing their house when I fixed their basement leak. Mr. Peterson was offered $200 to claim I'd damaged his plumbing instead of fixing it. Every single person Stephanie approached said no and immediately called David or Mrs. Vanessa. "This is witness tampering," Sarah Martinez told me when I brought her the documentation. "Stephanie's not just fighting a property dispute anymore, she's actively committing felonies." But Stephanie wasn't done digging her own grave. Her next brilliant idea was to start a whisper campaign about my mental health. She began telling people that overseas veterans like me were unstable and prone to violent episodes. She suggested that my 5-year absence proved I was running from something, and that the community needed protection from dangerous individuals. This strategy backfired spectacularly when Mrs. Vanessa organized what she called a neighborhood appreciation gathering for the following Saturday. 23 residents showed up to my apartment with casseroles, homemade cookies, and enough gratitude to make a grown man tear up. "We wanted you to know," said Mr. Peterson, speaking for the group, "that we don't believe a word Stephanie's been saying. You've done more for this community in 3 weeks than she's done in 3 years." The Garcias brought their new baby to meet me. Mrs. Henderson presented me with a hand-knitted scarf for next winter. David Kim brought copies of all the financial documents Stephanie had tried to hide. It was like a Norman Rockwell painting, except instead of pie-cooling windowsills, we were planning to expose municipal fraud. Stephanie drove by twice during the gathering, slowing down to stare at the crowd gathered in my parking lot. The look on her face suggested she was finally beginning to understand that her divide-and-conquer strategy had backfired completely. But the final escalation came 3 days before the 4th of July barbecue. I was reviewing last-minute details with Pavel when my phone rang. It was Jake, my 19-year-old son, calling from Chicago. "Dad, some woman called Mom's house asking questions about you. Said she was doing a background check for community safety. Made it sound like you were applying to work at a school or something." That crossed a line. Going after my neighbors was bad enough, but dragging my family into Stephanie's games was unforgivable. I called Sarah immediately. "Sarah, Stephanie just contacted my ex-wife as part of her investigation. Is that legal?" "Depends on what she asked and how she identified herself. But Danny, if she misrepresented herself as conducting an official investigation, that's impersonating a public official. That's a felony." Stephanie had just handed me another weapon to use against her. The question was whether I'd need it, or if her 4th of July humiliation would be enough to end this once and for all. The weekend before the 4th of July barbecue, Stephanie made her final desperate play. I was having coffee with Mrs. Vanessa on Sunday morning when David Kim called with news that made my blood pressure spike about 40 points. "Danny, you need to know what happened at yesterday's emergency board meeting," David said. His voice had that tight quality that meant someone was about to get royally screwed. "Stephanie convinced the remaining board members to vote for condemning your house." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. "She what?" "Property condemnation. Stephanie's claiming that because you've been harassing residents and threatening community safety, your presence constitutes a public nuisance. They voted to begin eminent domain proceedings to force you out of the neighborhood entirely." Mrs. Vanessa was listening to my side of the conversation, and her face went through about 6 different shades of angry. "That woman has lost her damn mind," she muttered. David continued, "She's also filed a complaint with the city claiming your apartment is being used as a base of operations for criminal activity. Says you've been conducting unlicensed business operations and storing hazardous materials." The hazardous materials were Pavel's valve equipment, stored in my garage for the final installation. Stephanie must have seen Pavel carrying the hydraulic components and decided they looked dangerous enough to make a case. David, how is any of this legal? It's not, but Stephanie's got a sympathetic ear in the city planning office. Some assistant commissioner named Bradley Hutchins who apparently owes Stephanie's family some favors. Bradley's been pushing the condemnation paperwork through without proper review. I hung up and stared at Mrs. Vanessa, who was already reaching for her phone. Who are you calling? My granddaughter Jessica. She's an investigative reporter for Channel 7 News. Seems to me the public might be interested in how HOA board members can condemn property they don't own to cover up their own fraud. While Mrs. Vanessa worked her media connections, I called Sarah Martinez with an emergency that couldn't wait for business hours. Sarah, Stephanie's trying to condemn my house. Can she actually do that? Not legally, no, but she can tie you up in court for months while the process plays out. It's an intimidation tactic, force you to spend money on legal fees while she destroys evidence of her fraud. That's when I realized Stephanie's strategy had evolved. She wasn't trying to win legitimately anymore. She was trying to exhaust my resources and patience until I gave up and went away. It was the nuclear option. If she couldn't keep the parking lot, she'd make sure I couldn't stay to enjoy getting it back. But Stephanie had made a crucial miscalculation. She assumed I was just some working-class guy who couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle. What she didn't know was that my 5 years overseas had left me with substantial savings, zero debt, and absolutely nothing to lose. More importantly, her condemnation scheme had finally pushed the community past their tolerance point. Mrs. Vanessa's phone call to her granddaughter Jessica triggered a domino effect that Stephanie never saw coming. Jessica Vanessa Martinez, she'd kept both names for professional reasons, was exactly the kind of reporter who lived for stories about corruption and abuse of power. By Tuesday afternoon, she was interviewing residents, reviewing public records, and building a story that would air Thursday night, just before the 4th of July barbecue. Grandma says you're taking down the trust fund princess who's been stealing from the neighborhood, Jessica told me Wednesday afternoon. I've seen the financial records David Kim provided. This is Emmy-level fraud. Stephanie must have caught wind of the investigation because Wednesday night she made one final, spectacularly stupid decision. According to Mr. Peterson, who witnessed the whole thing, Stephanie showed up at the Channel 7 news van with a lawyer and tried to serve them with a cease and desist order. You should have seen it, Danny, Mr. Peterson told me Thursday morning. Stephanie's standing there in her designer dress and heels, waving papers at Jessica while she's filming her. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear into the sidewalk. The cease and desist order claimed that Jessica's investigation was harassment and interfering with legitimate business operations. It demanded that she stop interviewing residents and return all documents related to HOA finances. Jessica's response was to air a preview segment Thursday morning showing Stephanie trying to intimidate journalists. The footage made her look exactly like what she was, a privileged princess having a tantrum because someone was finally holding her accountable. By Thursday afternoon, everyone in Willowbrook knew that Channel 7 would be covering the 4th of July barbecue live. Stephanie had inadvertently turned her community celebration into the perfect venue for her very public downfall. Pavel and I did the final valve installation Thursday night. Everything was ready. Stephanie's empire would literally and figuratively go down the drain in front of 200 witnesses and a live television audience. July 4th, 2025 dawned clear and hot, the kind of Midwestern summer day that makes asphalt soft and tempers shorter. By 11 a.m., Stephanie had already set up her command post in the parking lot office trailer, directing volunteers who were hanging red, white, and blue banners between the light poles. I watched from my apartment window as residents started arriving with folding chairs and coolers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Stephanie was throwing her celebration on land she'd stolen, using money she'd embezzled, while trying to condemn my house to cover up her crimes. The Channel 7 news crew arrived at noon, parking their van strategically where they could capture both the crowd and the parking lot. Jessica Vanessa Martinez was already interviewing residents, building the context for what was about to unfold. At 12:30, Mike Brennan from County Code Enforcement showed up with 2 inspectors and clipboards thick enough to stop bullets. They stationed themselves near the parking lot entrance, officially there for a routine community safety inspection, but really there to document whatever was about to happen. Pavel was crouched in the drainage access tunnel, finger on the remote valve control, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. Danny, in Bucharest we say the best revenge is watching your enemy drown in their own stupidity. Today, we make this literally true. By 1 p.m., the parking lot was packed. 60 luxury cars gleaming in the afternoon sun, their owners mingling around folding tables loaded with potato salad and grilled corn. Stephanie was in her element, working the crowd in a red sundress and designer sandals, playing the role of gracious community leader. The smell of charcoal smoke mixed with hot asphalt created that distinctly American summer barbecue atmosphere. Kids were running between cars with sparklers. Elderly residents were comparing grandchildren photos, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to be there. For a moment, I almost felt bad about what was coming. Then I saw Stephanie pointing in my direction while talking to a group of newer residents, probably spinning her story about the dangerous veteran who was threatening their peaceful community. My sympathy evaporated. At 2 p.m., Stephanie climbed onto a small platform and grabbed a microphone. "Friends and neighbors," she announced, her voice carrying across the crowd, "I want to thank you all for making Willowbrook Estates the best community in the county." The crowd applauded politely. Stephanie was building up to something, probably another speech about how her leadership had made their lives better. "As your HOA president," she continued, "I'm proud to announce that our parking facility has generated enough revenue to fund several major improvements. We're looking at a new playground, upgraded street lighting, and possibly even a community pool renovation." More applause. Of course, anyone who'd seen David Kim's financial records knew that Stephanie had already spent that money on Lexus payments and spa weekends. That's when Jessica Vanessa Martinez stepped forward with her microphone. "Ms. Blackwood, can you comment on allegations that this parking facility was built on illegally appropriated private property?" Stephanie's face went through several interesting color changes. That's a legal matter that's been resolved through proper channels. What about claims that parking revenue has been diverted to personal expenses rather than community improvements?" The crowd was starting to murmur. This wasn't the kind of confrontation anyone expected at a 4th of July barbecue. Stephanie looked around desperately, probably hoping someone would create a distraction. That's when I decided it was time to make my entrance. I walked down from my apartment building, staying carefully outside the 50-foot restraining order boundary, and called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Stephanie, I think there's something you should know about that parking lot." Every head turned. The Channel 7 camera swiveled to follow the action. Stephanie looked like she was about to have a stroke. "This is private property," she yelled, pointing at me with manicured nails. "You're violating a restraining order." "Actually, Stephanie, you're the one on private property. This is my land, and I have the deed to prove it." I nodded to Pavel, who was watching from the drainage tunnel. He grinned and flipped the valve control switch. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Water began bubbling up from the drainage grates throughout the parking lot. Within seconds, brown, muddy water was flowing across the asphalt, seeking the lowest points where the luxury cars were parked. "What's happening?" someone shouted. "Sewage backup!" another voice called out. The water kept rising, 18 inches, then 2 feet. BMW sedans and Mercedes SUVs became islands in a sea of muddy water while their owners stood on car hoods, holding purses and cell phones above their heads. Stephanie was screaming into her microphone, "This is sabotage! Call the police! Someone's attacking our community!" I pulled out my surveyor's deed and held it up for the Channel 7 camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Danny Kowalski and this is my property. Ms. Blackwood built this parking lot without permission and has been stealing your money for 3 years. Mike Brennan chose that moment to approach Stephanie with his clipboard. "Ma'am, we need to discuss several code violations, including unpermitted construction and fraudulent utility connections." Stephanie was now standing ankle-deep in sewage water, her red sundress soaked, watching her empire literally wash away on live television. "Ms. Blackwood," I called out, "you built an illegal business on my land and embezzled community funds. The FBI would like to discuss your creative accounting." That was my mic drop moment. Stephanie's face said it all. She finally understood that her 5-year con game was over. The aftermath of what Channel 7 News dubbed the 4th of July flood moved faster than water flowing downhill. Within an hour of Stephanie's public humiliation, FBI financial crimes investigators were loading boxes of HOA records into unmarked vans, while tow trucks worked to extract luxury vehicles from what the local fire chief diplomatically called a sewage incident. Stephanie herself was arrested 3 days later on charges of embezzlement, tax fraud, and filing false municipal documents. Her arraignment made the front page of the Chicago Tribune with a photo of her in handcuffs, still wearing that red sundress that had become soggy evidence of her downfall. The legal resolution came together surprisingly quickly once all Stephanie's lies unraveled. Sarah Martinez negotiated a settlement that covered every angle. Stephanie's family trust paid $400,000 in restitution, $225,000 for the stolen parking revenue, plus damages and legal fees. The trust also covered all costs for properly installing drainage systems and bringing the parking facility up to code. More importantly, Stephanie was banned from any HOA leadership position in Illinois and required to pay back taxes on 3 years of unreported income. The IRS took a particularly dim view of her shell company scheme, adding another $100,000 in penalties and interest. But the real victory was watching the community heal itself. Mrs. Vanessa organized the transition to a new HOA board, with David Kim as treasurer and actual transparency in financial reporting. The first order of business was reducing parking fees from $75 to $25 per month, with free spaces guaranteed for veterans and seniors. It's amazing what happens when board members actually live in the community instead of treating it like their personal shopping fund, David said at the first legitimate board meeting in years. The parking facility itself got a complete overhaul. I signed a 10-year lease with the HOA that spelled out exactly how revenue would be used. 40% for parking maintenance, 30% for community improvements, 20% for an emergency fund, and 10% for administrative costs. Every dollar would be documented and reported quarterly. As for my original dream of building a workshop, that evolved into something better. Using my settlement money, I established the Willowbrook Veterans Workshop, a community space where veterans could learn trades, work on personal projects, and most importantly, connect with neighbors who appreciated their service rather than fearing it. The grand opening in October drew over 300 people. My sons Jake and Tommy drove down from Chicago, finally getting to see the workshop their old man had been planning for 7 years. Jake brought his girlfriend. Tommy brought his acceptance letter to community college for mechanical engineering. "Dad," Tommy said, watching me demonstrate proper pipe-fitting technique to a group of younger veterans, "this is way cooler than anything you could have built just for us." Pavel flew back from Bulgaria for the opening ceremony, bringing his wife and enough Bulgarian brandy to properly christen the hydraulic equipment. "Danny," he said, raising a glass, "in my country we have saying, 'The man who moves mountain begins by carrying away small stones.' You moved whole mountain of bureaucracy with one valve." Mrs. Vanessa cut the ribbon with a pair of garden shears, declaring the workshop a proper use of stolen money finally returned where it belongs. She'd become something of a local celebrity after Jessica's investigative series won a regional Emmy for exposing municipal corruption. The community benefits kept expanding. Workshop participants volunteered to maintain the playground equipment Stephanie had neglected. Veterans with construction experience offered free help to elderly residents who couldn't afford repairs. What started as a property dispute had become a neighborhood renaissance. 6 months later, I got a call from Jake with news that made everything worthwhile. "Dad, I've been thinking about changing my major to civil engineering, maybe specializing in water treatment systems. Think there might be room in the family business for someone who actually knows how to use a computer?" Today, if you drive through Willowbrook Estates, you'll see a thriving community where neighbors actually know each other's names. The parking lot still operates, but now the revenue funds genuine improvements rather than designer handbag collections. Stephanie's old office trailer has been replaced by a small community garden that Mrs. Vanessa manages with military precision. And if you're dealing with your own HOA nightmare, remember this: bullies like Stephanie count on you feeling powerless and isolated. But property records are public information, financial fraud leaves paper trails, and sometimes the best revenge is simply forcing someone to follow the rules they've been breaking. Document everything, know your rights, and never be afraid to call in the experts when someone's stealing what belongs to you.